All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Good morning. Welcome to the ISCBacademy webinar series on native voices in computational biology. We are Krystal Tsosie, who is an indigenous geneticist and ethicist and statistician based now at Vanderbilt University, one of the founders of the Native Biodata Consortium. And I know you've all been waiting eagerly to hear what she has to say. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Krystal.
Yat Evana, thank you so much for your kind patience and waiting for me to get on board. I swear I thought this was 11 a.m. Pacific, wrong time zone, so I apologize. You get to see me in my rawness this morning. So I think this will make for a very great, candid talk, actually. Today's talk is going to be about open access data and the continued bio-exploitation of indigenous genomes. And I'm really, I think this is a key important topic considering where we are moving in terms of big data science. And I feel like we are too easily fall into the cult of big data and open access data. And I really want to talk about what this actually means for the indigenous populations that we're trying to engage. So thank you so much, Dr. Hunter, for that great introduction. Just to orient everyone geographically, my institution is at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, but I have had the great pleasure of working with tribal communities in the Dakotas, particularly in North Dakota and South Dakota. And then right now, currently, I've been sheltering in place closer to my home community in Phoenix, Arizona. And I love talking about what, in terms of my journey of becoming an indigenous scientist, is completely rooted and grounded in the experiences that I had growing up. So my people, Dene people, are comprise one of the largest, or is the largest tribe, by which, if you look at our geography in terms of what kind of land base our people have. And, I really like to point people to the image on the right, which is actually my grandmother's house. It's a modernized one-room hogan. And, this is a house that's still powered by coal with a single coal stove in the middle. And you can't really see it because it's faded, but the tar paper that's on the side used to say flammable on the side of it. And just, I really like highlighting this image because when we're talking about, particularly with COVID-19, and in terms of the effect of the pandemic on our home communities, I really want to not only point to the fact that there are indeed structural barriers related to access to health that really we need to keep in mind when we're talking about next advances of precision medicine, when in reality we're talking about access for 250,000 people who have to travel hours to get to their nearest healthcare clinic, such that the lifespan for many tribal people are less than the national average. So, but I also want to counter this because I don't want this to come from a deficit, a narrative deficit. I want this to come from a point of cultural resiliency that we have, at least for my people, we've been able to maintain our land base, and our culture talk about building sustainable health equity. And that health equity has to be on the terms of the community, not necessarily a superimposed decision extrinsically defined by outsiders. So we really have to talk about other components of health rather than genomics in terms of sociocultural economic factors. And that's kind of the point that I want everyone to keep in mind today, that when you have differences in health outcomes that are linked to these structural barriers to access to care, we're going to have disparities in health, such that if you look at any measure or any health outcome, compared to the dominant population, American Indians and Alaska Natives fare worse, unfortunately. And as an indigenous geneticist, there's this huge push towards increasing diversity in genomic studies. But what this means is that if you look at the trajectory of trying to increase inclusivity in genomics research over the past decade, we still see that Indigenous people still constitute less than 1% of research participants. And I want to bring this up because too often the question is couched as, how do we get Indigenous people comfortable with research? But in reality, that question should be, how do we protect the interests of Indigenous peoples if they want to engage in research? And the distinction is important because we want to make sure that this is a non-coercive stance at trying to get people to engage in genomics. And I think this is unfortunately a point that's often missed. That the reason why that we have seen this lack of engagement in genetic studies is for a variety of reasons, be it cultural, political, due to some measure of distrust. And when we talk about bioethics in biology, too often the conversation of bioethics stops at Tuskegee in 1970s, but we don't really know, or we don't teach often, the ethical controversies that are more recent within the last couple of years. And, we really don't talk about what it means to actually change the narrative so that these issues of distrust are actually moved forward, so that rather than gaining the comfort of Indigenous peoples, really, again, the conversation should be, how do we empower Indigenous peoples so that they could perhaps do some of this research for themselves? So really, what I want to talk about the first couple of moments in this topic is talking about recent research in Indigenous genomics and talking more about what the landscape has looked like in the last 20 years. And I want to start with the Human Genome Diversity Project, because the legacy of HGDP is such that all of the questions related to potential commercial exploitation of Indigenous DNA are not new questions. These are questions that were born over 20 years ago, but still continue to persist, especially as we move toward this open access philosophy. And then I want to talk a little bit more about what this potentially means for a Southwestern tribe. And then introduce the concepts related to individual versus group informed consent, because I think this is really foundational if we want to implement change in how we consent participants. And lastly, talk about an example, particularly our biobank, our Indigenous-led biobank, which is the NBDC, or Native Biodata Consortium, and measures that we're trying to take in order to advance, the next 20 plus years, hopefully, what Indigenous genomics could look like for us. So here's a timeline for what Indigenous genomics research has looked like over the last 20 years. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but really, I want to point to years 2000 and 2018. Year 2000, international news of misuse of Nuu-chah-nulth samples broke, in which a researcher basically traveled across international borders, not just once, but twice, with several hundred samples collected from Indigenous peoples without tribal consent. And then, now you probably heard about recent discussions that are ongoing about the newest large-scale diversity project, All of Us, which right now is undergoing criticisms from some Indigenous groups that they are recruiting from urban populations without community consent. So really, this notion of tribal consent is something that has persisted over the last 20 years and will continue to recycle if we don't ever address it. But really, I want to concentrate on this period, 2005 to approximately really what we're seeing right now. Is we're seeing a resurgence in questions, whereas before we were talking about who owns samples and we're talking about sample provenance. And those questions are now being retranslated to who owns data and who has governance over those data. What does it mean when we look at the landscape of tribal consent? Like, what is actually happening? Are researchers actually properly engaging with community to gain consent to access community members? And then one thing that I wish I could go furthermore in, will in the future, is talking about the shift from broad informed consent to study-specific informed consent, and now back to broad informed consent in the big data era. So a number of the issues that occurred, particularly with a landmark case, Havasupai versus the Arizona Board of Regents, in which a tribe sued the major state universities in Arizona for unconsented use of samples and violations of trust. A lot of these issues were related to broad consenting, in which a researcher would take it upon him or herself or themselves to decide what would be the type of research that could be conducted utilizing indigenous samples. Usually it was in the context of the greater good, but it was kind of a carte blanche for allowing a researcher to make those decisions on behalf of the tribe. And for the most part, it really didn't benefit the tribes to begin with. So we had this shift to study-specific consenting, in which every single iteration of a research aim had to be shifted. And that became too logistically burdensome for researchers who are not really that well trained in community-based consenting, but would find it expensive and timely to recontact geographically mobile and rural tribal community members just to continue the progress of a longitudinal study. And then now with big data and everything being harmonized, we're seeing that shift back to broad informed consent, but without necessarily addressing all of the problematic issues that occurred in the past. So when talking about HGDP, we're starting really talking about 1993, in which scientists began this project to map genetic variation of human populations worldwide. And immediately upon the announcement of the study, indigenous peoples worldwide were opposing the project. And in 2005, we really have a major landmark paper of HGDP, in which they published a review showing, in their mind, successful recruitment of 51 global populations, including indigenous groups, largely from Central and South America, as shown by the map in purple. And the success of this project also led to another privately funded offshoot, the Geographic project, whose purpose was to map ancient migratory patterns using genetic information. And the goal was to collect DNA from as many indigenous populations as possible before, and it's interesting when you read the researchers at the time describing the urgency for these large-scale diversity projects, because they were sort of housing it in terms such as importance of sampling these populations that were subject to being extinct. And there are variations of this language used in advertising these projects. And in particular, the Geographic project was called a vampire project because in perspective of community members' minds, researchers would come into their communities, take as many blood samples as possible, and disappear within a short period of time, not unlike a vampire or vampire bat in the middle of the night. And just talk about the cultural incongruency of the aims of the projects related to imagery used on the pamphlets. For instance, this is a pamphlet by the National Geographic project stating, tracing the journey of our ancestors, and evoking this ancestral information. But really, you have to point fun at their use of skull imaging. The best way to entice indigenous peoples to participate is to put this culturally sensitive information and imagery on the pamphlet itself. It is completely and has always been problematic. But in response to these large-scale diversity projects, what we have in response is UNDRIP, or the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And in particular, this petition was signed by over 683 indigenous nations worldwide, recommending the cessation of the Geographic project. And shortly after these projects, we have the beginning of genetic ancestry testing, such that when 23andMe was launched, it was named the Invention of the Year by Time Magazine, shortly followed by Ancestry DNA. And, really have to point to this this point in time, just because when we talk about the popularity of these genetic ancestry tests, we're really talking about a rapid increase in the biocollections of samples and data that people are willingly paying money towards. But what they really don't understand is that they're paying to have their information used by a for-profit company to develop technologies that, is effectively a form of bioexploitation. But it's really interesting when we talk about in relation to Native American ancestry, because when we look at 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, the number one question that's asked by consumers is, why is my Native American ancestry not showing up? Which is an interesting question, especially when we start calling back from how that information has been procured. And then going back to, of course, where we talk about 1,000 Genomes Project and the HTTP, a number of those samples that have informed genetic ancestry test kits were available, publicly available, for the use now that 23andMe and Ancestry DNA actually use those databases for their technologies. So whereas Ancestry DNA is now posting something to the effect of billions of dollars for the last several holiday quarters, when we're talking about the promises that were initially made to Indigenous communities from whom those samples were procured, we see headlines like this, where people from Central and South America are stating that researchers promised interventions to their tribe or participating in this study, but they haven't, even a decade later, haven't seen those promises actually come to fruition. And yet, when we talk about the amount of money that has been made from their openly available data, we really do have to ask, for whom does this actually benefit? Is it benefiting the people who provided the sample, or is it benefiting somebody else? And, just to also mention, these databases are highly commercially valuable in that we've seen several acquisitions and reacquisitions of companies for these data sets. So even protections are subject to being sold for the highest dollar. In addition to the fact that genetic ancestry testing, particularly for Indigenous peoples, is highly problematic because it's totally incongruent with the way that we consider our kinship structures, which are not through biological lines but also cultural lines. But really what these direct-to-consumer genetic testing companies are promising is an interchangeability of ancestral and personal identity that is reified in biology, and this is incredibly problematic. And just to have this point in context to this discussion, Indigenous peoples do not construct our sense of belonging and citizenships in the form of DNA. It's a matter of how we call ourselves a community or community members. It's, as Dr. Kim Tallbear states all the time, it's not a matter of what you claim, but it's a matter of who claims you. So going to the second point of a brief case study talking about the Akama Otham. So from this point on, I'm going to refer to, many people know them as the Pima, but that's an anglicized colonized name of their actual name, which is the Akama Otham, or the river people, and I'm just going to refer to them as the Otham from this point on. The Otham live in the central and southern Arizona along two rivers, and talking particularly about two different reservations that sort of are adjacent to the Phoenix metropolitan area, which is the Gila River Indian Community, the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. And the reason why I'm highlighting this sample, this case example, is because, this group of individuals has been called the most studied group for causes and consequences of diabetes. And the interest in collecting information from this community is due to their high prevalence of type 2 diabetes, and that over 94% of adults will have an onset of type 2 diabetes. And while there's a heavy interest in investigating genetic causes for this disparate health outcome, there's a lot of evidence to state that this is actually more related to differences in diet, in that we have had, due to Westernization and assimilation policies, have imposed a diet that is not consistent with how these individuals actually procured food for themselves, and that the traditional diet was more along the lines of lean proteins and complex carbohydrates. So really, this has been really important because in this old Arizona Republic article, they stated that this tribe has passively engaged in a 40-plus year-long study with the NIH, in which the NIH promised to find the cause and prevent diabetes. But really, there are questions as to whether or not their efforts for finding funding for preventive health studies was adequate. And in the tribal first line perspectives, according to the article, there were underfunded education efforts to teach self-management of the disease. And there's just huge questions, because once the study has officially ended new participant recruitment, there's always a question of what's happening with the data, especially if it's under question how much engagement the tribe has had in terms of providing decision-making authority on what's happening with the data from those samples. And we can see in the literature that there have been a number of studies in which awesome biomarkers, either from the US or from the Mexico side, because this is a group that transcends our artificial colonized borders. It's a matter of what's happening to the data now. When we talk about what it takes to come up with the next technological innovation and development of intellectual property, all we really need are ancestral informative markers from a well-characterized reference group to really make a platform with some real commercial power. And here we have now several databases with awesome biomarkers that several researchers have put forward as creating that technology. And we still have to question, what are the tribes getting out of this, and how much input did the tribes have? And this is just another one that came out at the beginning of this year, which I want to point out as being particularly problematic, because here we have an example of a platform whose abbreviation is Pima, a name that is culturally incorrect for referring to this group, but also naming a platform for a community who has actually willingly disengaged from genomics research. I feel like this title is just, unfortunately, a slap in the face for really how we should be engaging and respecting tribes who participate or have contributed information to these beginning platforms. Just going to number 3, this is really talking about a larger issue in the terms of how we're consenting individuals and communities as a whole. So in the US, there are over 570 plus, now 574 federally recognized tribes. But of these, few of these actually have their own research oversight. Only about 20 have their own research regulatory boards, or RRBs. A number of them rely on the larger Indian Health Service IRB to provide their research oversight. And then some of them have their own distinct structures, and there's quite a bit of heterogeneity in how an individual tribe regulates research. It could just be a tribal official signing off on an approval for a study, or it could be like a subcommittee that's in charge of making these decisions. But whether or not these structures are recognized is of concern, especially when we are talking about, whether or not a university IRB even recognizes the tribal RRB's authority, or whether or not the authority of the tribe's research regulatory structure of choice is recognized by the NIH. So when we're talking about how research used to be conducted in Indigenous communities, it used to be, or often still is that a researcher, largely non-Indigenous, would rely on his or her or their own university IRB to gain access to tribal participants. What we as Indigenous scientists would like it to be, or Indigenous people like to see done, is a researcher relying on a tribal IRB or RRB to gain access to tribal participants. But, what we're seeing is that because of this great heterogeneity in research regulatory structures, or the unfamiliarity of a researcher and how to navigate this, or the lack of time taken to be able to even learn how to negotiate all these different pathways, what can end up happening is, a researcher may not have the time or have the available effort to be able to navigate these structures. And in particular in urban settings, what we're seeing is that researchers may just rely on their own university IRB to gain access to tribal participants. So we're really not respecting, tribal agency in this context, even as we start encouraging these tribal regulatory research structures to be in place. And so in this paper that I and other Indigenous geneticists put forward a couple of years ago, we highlighted ethical principles for delineating an equitable framework for what genomics research should look like in Indigenous communities. And these are largely framed by larger community-based participatory research principles that have been in place in social science disciplines, particularly in environmental justice research from the 1970s. But really, it's interesting that this is considered an innovation for applying this in the biological research setting as of a couple years ago. And it's really nice to see that researchers nowadays in the life sciences space are really thinking more about engagement, in which at every single research step, be it from determination of aims to the protocols and research development and dissemination, that really we're trying to engage the community at every aspect. But that works in a community context. And it can be easier to place and enforce protections at the tribal community level, but there needs to be more considerations for Indigenous individuals residing outside of tribal communities. We have to acknowledge that due to forced assimilation policies, now roughly 3/4 of Native Americans live in urban or suburban areas. So, while it's great that we have these community engaged models, they may not be sufficient. They may not be sufficient because of lack of familiarity with these community engaged models or lack of support for training. But also we have to acknowledge that until we allocate enough time for these community relationships to be built, academic researchers and other researchers are going to be subject to these publish or perish timelines, which may not be amenable for taking the time to develop an adequate relationship with tribes. So what we're seeing is that, unfortunately, there are more and more ways in which non-Indigenous researchers can circumvent tribal review procedures, be it passively recruiting from large cities with a high Native American population, targeting Native American and their descendants using direct consumer testing, or just actively pursuing urban individuals. And this goes back to the point I made earlier about the All of Us program. In that, if you look at the timeline of the All of Us program, it was announced in, I think, 2015 or 2016 as the Precision Medicine Initiative. And even though it was announced as a diversity initiative and means for recruiting and overrepresentation of previously underrepresented groups, there really wasn't an effort to begin consultation with tribal nations until spring of last year, when the program actually started recruiting, which, it really lends to the question about how important consultation has been with tribes, especially when you think about the fact that these tribal consultation sessions have been were hastily convened, very poorly advertised, closed to journalists, and there's been questions about lack of transparency about what the discussions have actually looked like within the context of these forums, and whether or not the conversation in these forums is actually bidirectional or if it's unidirectional, in that researchers are just telling tribes what they plan to do with them, as opposed for asking for equitable participation. So the bidirectionality, unidirectionality is key here. But of criticism as well is that, the All of Us research program, even though they're not collecting genetic data at this point, it's purely more health data, they're still recruiting from large urban cities such as Phoenix and Tucson. And, there's some question as to whether or not they're actually gaining tribal consent or even permission of tribes to collect group identifying data like tribal affiliation data from participants. And, of course, questions as to whether or not there are enough Indigenous peoples who are part of these decision-making authorities. So this is something that just really highlights these tensions between group consent versus individual consent. And just if we think about what individual informed consent looks like in westernized context, we have to remember that standard informed consent language really centers the balance of risks and benefits on the individual. And this is already culturally inconsistent with how Indigenous communities govern themselves. We govern ourselves in terms of a more communitarian ethic, in which we believe that we should have the consent of the group before we move forward on something, as opposed to this individual American democratic format that we have. And then we also have to think about DNA as the ultimate group identifier. So what we're talking about is not just risks for re-identifying an individual, but risks for re-identifying a group and perhaps stigmatizing a group, or just making inferences about a group utilizing a subset of membership. So really, when we talk about the standard for individual informed consent, it's truly inadequate for Indigenous communities, especially in relation to genomics, which is a piece that we highlighted in our Nature 2019 commentary. And really, if we want to think about in terms of advancing what consent should be, so it's truly informed consent, because anything not passing that standard is actually failing to fully inform a potential participant. We really need a statement about group risk on the consent form. Something to the effect of, if you're a member of a small population, your individual data could be used to make general statements about the entirety of your respective group. And really ensuring that members who come from underrepresented communities understand that it's not just their risks and benefits at key, but also whoever they are a member of in terms of communities. So what we're really talking about Indigenous genomic data sovereignty, which was really largely the right of Indigenous nations and peoples to exercise autonomy to protect their interests related to genomic data. And that brings me to my last section, which is talking about NBDC and data governance. So the Native Biodata Consortium is at this point, the first Indigenous-led biological data repository within tribal jurisdiction acting on behalf of U.S. tribes. So our board members comprise of community members from the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe and other Indigenous communities. And we are formalized as a 501c3 nonprofit organized under tribal and federal law. And really, when we look at the purpose and mission of our organization, we're not really our goal is not to just advance precision health science omics for individuals, but also doing it in a way that truly takes into account community engagement ethics and advancing tribal regulatory procedures and advancing Indigenous data sovereignty policy and sustainability. We're not just looking at biological factors that contribute to health, but really want to look at environmental and other health factors. And also at the same time, assisting the communities that we work with in developing data protections and data sharing policies that would enable them to participate in federally funded research in a way that makes them feel like they can trust those protective measures, and really just trying to advance Indigenous data sovereignty. And this brings us to a point related to data governance, because if you look at the literature related to data governance, it's, questions about how data should be governed are really well formulated in industry, but not necessarily in research. We don't have too many models. Of course, that's changing. But what we see is a lot of philosophy on how data should be governed. And a lot of it centers on questions about who owns or has stewardship over data. And just conceptualize what we have, how we framed data governance. We conceptualized these different models along the spectrum. So on the left, we have complete tribal disengagement. It's kind of a null model in which tribes may choose for whatever reason to not to actively participate in research. And on the right side is a sort of kind of a theoretical model. It's tribally driven research, or TDR, which is something that was advanced by Dr. Eddie Brown at Arizona State University in the 90s, in which the tribe has complete ownership or stewardship over decisions related to collection, storage, and usage of data. And what we have is really some means in between, in which either the tribe has no or little ownership of their stewardship of data, in which an outside entity makes those decisions on behalf of tribes, or the tribe might have some ownership or stewardship in working with a contractee or a partner to assist in these questions. And what we did at the NBDC was we've done a lot of qualitative research studies, be it focus groups or deliberations, to sort of ask tribal community members how they felt genomic and health data should be governed within the context of their community. And it's really interesting, actually, that, within Indigenous communities, there's, of course, distrust related to biomedical research, but there's also some questions about how governance should look like within the context of our community. So we have to think about it. One of our original thoughts was that we would help the tribe create a biobank. But this led to questions about sustainability and longevity, like who would be the local actors in place to keep the biobank going, or biorepository going. And it's also a huge ask to ask a tribe to take a portion of their already finite budget and then ask them, hey, on top of all the other important decisions you have to make related to water and resource management and education and power, let's ask you to take a portion of your finite budget and, have you run a biobank. That's not really a good sustainable model anyway. But there's also this interesting question about trust. So going back to the point that Indigenous communities we have large kinship structures within our communities, and we're also small, but everyone knows each other. There was a question about having tribal leaders, who are often our cousins, be in charge of confidential data related to health and genomics. And, because of this, because of everyone knowing each other in a small tribal context, actually it was interesting to hear that tribal members actually felt like they would rather entrust those data decisions to an outside entity comprised of knowledgeable leaders or people like indigenous scientists to be able to make those decisions on behalf of them, but still work within the larger context of tribal jurisdictions and regulations. So really out of this, we came up with another model, which, is kind of in between the two middle models that I presented before, in which the tribe still has complete ownership of and stewardship of the data, but they're just entrusting a native third party for these issues related to confidentiality and trust. So, right now it's, going full circle back to this notion of trust. A number of U.S. tribes don't participate in federally funded research because of this requirement to deposit data into an open repository or a repository such as dbGaP or the databases of genotypes and phenotypes. And tribes don't really like this particular option because it takes those data decisions outside of the provenance of tribes and puts it in the place of researchers. And, there's a question of how much authority tribes are going to have in how those decisions are made for accessing their research data. But nothing really stipulates that it has to be a database such as dbGaP. What if we were to provide an alternative, such as a tribally managed biorepository? Could the story be different? And we're really hoping that the existence of our facility will enable tribes to utilize their tribal sovereignty to be able to not only extend regulation over their data and limit researchers' jurisdictions, but also help bridge that gap in data equity. So really, when we're talking about issues related to ethics, equity, and justice, we have to think about this in terms of how we're talking about advances in precision medicine genomics. Because right now, all of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of discoveries have already been taken and have already been discovered. The next discoveries are going to be likely found in small, untested populations, such as tribes, which are the same groups that have been historically oppressed in science. So really, there's a lot of interest, especially nowadays, in looking at rare variants or variants in populations that have been underrepresented historically in science. But if we're not going to be changing, what we need to do is change the field so that we can correct those power imbalances that have led to these bioethical questions and controversies from the past. And again, we're talking about the past. We're not talking about 1970s. We're talking about within the last 15 to 20 years, and even now. What we really need to be talking about is empowering Indigenous-led research. So empowering Indigenous-led biorepositories, empowering Indigenous data sovereignties, and empowering the decision of tribes to be able to make research decisions for themselves and their people. So yeah, thank you so much. And I think we have time for questions still.
Awesome. That was really interesting, Krystal. And while I'm looking for questions in the chat or the questions part, but while we wait for some of those, I have some questions. That was a really intriguing talk. So let's start off with how to create more Indigenous-led science. So you've been a member of the SING Consortium, which has done amazing work in bringing together Indigenous researchers and training new students. Can you talk about how that might scale? How can we increase the capacity of Indigenous folks to do research and bring more people to the table?
Yeah, definitely. So this is a very unique point in time in that never before has there been this many Indigenous scientists and Indigenous geneticists. So we have an opportunity now where Indigenous scientists who have been trained are now in places and positions of authority within universities to be able to mentor the next generation of Indigenous scientists. We also have an increased level of connectivity not just within the US, but also internationally. And social media has definitely been able to advance this ability for us to network with future early career scientists and emerging early career scientists. And this is also a unique point in time. Year 2020 has been really pivotal in actually understanding that these issues related to race and racism and inequities in health or inequities in general really need to be put at the forefront by members of communities themselves, as opposed to relying on, sorry to say, largely white scientists and academics to do this for us. So, some of the things that we need to look at are ensuring that there is a place for having these cultural perspectives in science and research that is not considered antithetical to Western science. There's been a lot of questions this year about indigenous science being dichotomized falsely against Western science, when really we need to be talking about just science as a whole. Because, for centuries, indigenous peoples have been doing scientific methods, research and observations and creating new knowledge systems. It's just now in this century, has it been cloaked, or the last 100 years has been cloaked within these two schools of thought. But we also have to ensure that we do it in a way that's not extractive, and really ensures that we're not just looking to promoting underrepresented scientists as being access points to these communities for research. So there are power dynamics in play in academia in which, I'm just going to say this as somebody who doesn't have my PhD yet, but has 2 master's degrees. And because of my lack of a PhD, it prevents me from being a PI on my own studies that I'm putting forward. There is this false artifice of expertise within academia that we have to acknowledge is very recent and is drawn along colonial power structures. And if we want to implement and advance science and research as a whole, we need to get beyond that and acknowledge that there are knowledge leaders and experts who are outside of academia or even outside of life sciences, and really just be more inclusive to perspectives outside of these artificial colonial lines of expertise. So that's just a number of methods right there.
Well, that's a major challenge, Krystal, and taken. I want to, there's a question in the chat from Janice Geary. And she says, I was wondering if Krystal knew of any examples of ethics boards or tribal research organizations that require including group risk in their informed consent documents that are provided to research participants.
So this is an interesting question. It's something that I have been suggesting more to tribal research organizations to include in their informed consent policies. But we have to look at this in terms of how are consent protocols generated. They're first usually generated by researchers themselves who are largely outsiders to the community. And then, tribal research ethics boards are still relatively new at navigating these nuances. And for the most part, of course, they've been following federal guidelines, but they're still in the process of advancing those guidelines for themselves. So usually the questions of evaluating incoming protocol by a researcher is along the lines of, largely, is this research going to be culturally harmful, and what are the cultural risks at the study level? But in terms of language related to the consent level, there's still a lot of advances that need to be made, particularly in genomics, because one of the criticisms I have is that, perhaps there needs to be more understanding about the differences in genetic risks. For instance, having broad language such as, participants agree to be part of a genetic study or genetically look at variants associated with X. That's not specific to the sensitivity and the level of interrogation that, for instance, whole genome sequencing can have versus like a candidate SNP-based approach. So, there's just a lot of education that needs to be have on both sides for researchers to be able to both suggest that level of risk level, and then also for tribal research boards to even have that requirement on their end, especially when they're just, again, trying to just become great authorities for evaluating incoming protocols on a longevity basis. So there's room for improvement.
Just to follow up on that, I was kind of curious what you thought about how non-tribal small groups are affected by genomic research in the same way. So, for example, when I consent to participate in some sort of genomics project, all of my close relatives are sort of sucked up into that project, and personal information about them could be revealed by that, and they don't get any say in whether or not I consent to do that. So is there a broader issue that really, can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh my gosh, this is something that I have gotten into heated discussions on airplanes with random strangers about, actually. This actually calls into a larger question about data privacy and data surveillance, especially when we talk about DNA. So an example that I like to give is the Golden State Killer, right? The Golden State Killer was re-identified by a random third cousin that contributed his material to like a site like GEDmatch or Family Tree, or there's an article that came out that there was actually a third database in play. So people freely uploading, because they felt like they had the individual right to do so, their information onto an open, available access platform, but not realizing that it's not just their risks and benefits centered on themselves, but also everyone they're biologically related to. And usually the counter to this is, well, at least this will help, the greater good of identifying serial killers. Well, let's acknowledge, first of all, that serial killers make a very small minority of our population. But let's also acknowledge that the flip side of that argument is that this opens up the possibility for racially identifying groups and doing group stigmatization. In that, there's already a lot of issues related to racial injustice in our criminal justice system. And there's a huge possibility that re-identifying the group based off of DNA is in a criminal setting has the potential to biologically reify negative stereotypes that already persist in our criminal justice system. Another counter usually to this is, well, it could potentially help re-identify missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? Well, how about addressing the larger issue of asking, why is it that our women in our communities are being disproportionately targeted for these violent acts perpetrated for outsider communities? Why does this have to be an intervention at the DNA level when it really should be a larger systemic issue that's addressed? And, in this case, I feel like we really should be asking these larger questions, especially related to health. In health, we're always promising the next innovation of precision medicine research. Well, I left the field of cancer biology because I felt like even if I were to develop a cancer drug or therapeutic within my lifetime that passed all clinical level trials, maybe by the time I was 70, it might be marketed, but would it actually benefit my native people? Probably not. And then I had this level of guilt about what am I doing in cancer biology? So when we're talking about precision medicine research, why are we talking about these future benefits of creating equity when really we have the opportunity right here, which is increasing access to healthcare? When we're talking about COVID and we're talking about how it disproportionately affects Native communities and Black communities, why aren't we opening up more health clinics? Why aren't we asking why people are not adequately insured? That is a larger question, probably will do more to affect increasing equity in healthcare than genomics. And that's me as a geneticist saying that.
That was a great answer, and it also captured a question from Howard Edenberg, so a similar question. So I'm going to move on to the next one, which comes from Hausmadine Othman. He says, thank you, Krystal. I would like to know your opinion about how much omics studies have had a positive impact on solving concrete problems of indigenous tribes, and if that's the case, to what extent?
There's a paper that our group is coming out with, which it has a proteomics approach toward looking at why rheumatoid arthritis is so disproportionately high in the community that we work with. So I don't want to. That paper is still ongoing. I don't want to speak too much to that, but there is a possibility that as we're moving from genomics to other types of omics, there are other advances in how we can look at disparities in health. And then, of course, then there's epigenomics, which has really advanced our knowledge of historical trauma and how that relates to transmission of stressors from mother to child and transgenerationally to affect health overall. And so those are just off the top of my head a couple of examples of other forms of omics that have contributed to our picture of health inequities in indigenous communities.
All right, well, we're more than 5 after the hour. There's one more. I'm going to take one more question. We're losing a little bit of our audience, but Hausmadine Othman has a follow-up. He says, I personally think the main driver for indigenous genomic studies is purely scientific, meaning the motivation comes from our greed to pile up data. How is the involvement of indigenous scientists going to help in this regard?
Yeah, great question. So the problem with big data is erasure. So there's this grab for data because we need to have an adequate sample size in order to have the power to detect associations. Well, indigenous communities are small. And bucketing us all into one category, into one strata is not going to solve that. It's going to lead to mixed effects issues. It's going to lead to population stratification issues. What we really need to do is talk about the power of small data sets and our ability to decrease the amount of missingness in our data. And that means generating more robust data sets that includes more covariates that contribute to health beyond just omics and whatever we can poorly phenotype from EHR data. And that's going to require looking at true cultural, economic, socioeconomic, and environmental factors, and working with communities help us get those type of information. Because who better to inform those types of questions and those information than the community members themselves who have lived within a traditional lifestyle and on the traditional lands for time immemorial. And so really what we're trying to do is not just advance, and talk about statistical power, because that's always going to lead to us being omitted from these data sets, but really talking about how can we have as complete of a data set as possible, even if we're only talking about a few hundred individuals. So indigenous scientists would bring that perspective. Great question.